$1,364. That total is higher than we had projected due to the state getting caught up on the categorical payments. The FY14 budget is balanced across the operating funds. Administration recommends the board approve the resolution adopting the school district U-46 budget for fiscal year 2014.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Could you guys clarify? I think that there's some confusion out there amongst the public regarding, there's somehow a thought that we are somehow voting to increase taxes tonight with this budget, that's the decision on the table. Could you elaborate on that? This is not a levy discussion. This is a budget discussion, and maybe you could explain the difference to clarify, bring some clarity to that.
Sure. The budget is an estimate of what we anticipate our revenues to be and what we expect. The actual tax levy process will be starting at the second meeting in October, and then that will be approved in early December. And that decision is really when it affects the taxpayers' property tax bill.
Okay, so to clarify further, regardless of a vote tonight, it does not raise nor decrease, it has no impact on a tax bill, property tax owner's tax bill.
That's correct.
Property owner's tax bill.
I wanted to know if you can tell me if there is an increase. I think I understood that the percentage increase of this budget from this year over last year was about 6%. Did I get that right? I don't know where.
Property taxes?
No, I'm talking about our overall budget for the district. I got that from the last meeting. Expenditures. Yeah. I wanted to know if you can tell me if there is how many, last meeting we were given information about the number of administrators we have compared to other districts. And I'm curious to know if we have any change in our student-to-teacher ratio, what it is compared to other districts, and if this budget represents an increase or a decrease in that student-to-teacher ratio.
So we don't have that information right in front of us right now, but we get it for you and respond to you in a memo back to the board.
We did add teaching positions in this budget.
And are they specific just to those programs that were highlighted? I mean, I understand that we're supporting and putting more funds towards certain programs. Dr. Torres outlines that. Is it just those programs that are getting any increase in teachers in the classroom?
Yeah, we can get the details for you, and I would love to see how the final staffing worked out now the school has started.
So it hasn't been determined yet, is what you're saying?
I thought we did discuss that it's keeping the staff ratio the same, that we're not changing that up or down. It's maintaining.
Right, the standard for the ratio stayed the same. However, we did hire more teaching staff. So there were .2s for each division put at the high schools. So between the high schools and the elementaries, I believe we were up by approximately 40 plus teachers. And we'll come out with our September 30 student counts, obviously, this week, so then we'd be able to generate a more current ratio for you. But I think we prefer to, instead of speculating a little bit, I mean, we have rough numbers, but we don't know the exact ratios. We would prefer to wait till the September 30th numbers come out, and then we can give the board an exact ratio figure.
The final is usually September 30th, and the enrollment figures is when we then first cement the staffing, but then, because there can still be ups and downs, ups really, not downs. The comparison to other districts is not something that we can do until the state reports, because that's what we use. We use a state report card for that, and we use the latest available data for that. We can share our data based on what we have, but we wouldn't be able to share what other districts are doing because we don't have that data in front of us. As I was just mentioned, we added some staff for art, music, and PE. For the point two, we wanted to provide some additional support around instructional leadership for the secondary schools. So we added some coaching at the local school level, and those numbers can be reported, but are reflected in this budget. And I think those are the questions. With regard to administrators, we've provided that information, but again, we can't compare it with other districts because we're not.
And can you remind us what this, I remember seeing this, but it's not in, or I don't know where I saw this at the last meeting, about the surplus that we have. What surplus are you anticipating again for this coming fiscal year? Wasn't there a small surplus?
The presentation that, from the last meeting was referring to the operating funds, the balance. Yeah, so the operating funds are the education fund, operations and maintenance fund, and the transportation fund. So our budget for those three funds for this upcoming year is pretty much break even.
So what was the surplus then? I misunderstood you.
So our surplus from from last year ended up at about 19 million in addition to previous balance, and 13 million of that came from the state categoricals.
Right, but did you say you're anticipating a surplus this year, or you're not? I misunderstood something.
You said around
I
5
think what I
million, which
said-
is.
Yeah, I was talking about the total fund balances, all funds
Right.
combined increased about 4.9 million.
That was for last year.
That's last year. That's,
Are you anticipating any for this year, surplus?
no, what we have in the budget for all funds is actually a decrease due to the capital projects, transferring the money out with cash from the previous bond issue.
So, to the revenue piece, the first line in the revenue portion talks about taxes, talks about last year, the budget was based on $289,692,000 tax. No, sorry, zoomed too far. So anyway, so last year was 291,139,000. This year would be 294,205,000. That is an increase of just over $3 million in tax. But we haven't yet voted on a tax levy or a tax increase. What are we basing that number on?
So the tax levies cross into two fiscal years. So half of the money in this current year is based on last year's levy. Last year's levy was 3% CPI. So that would be 1.5% for that.
So the entire $3 million came from last year's tax increase?
That's pretty much, what you're looking at is budget to budget. So the 291 is what we had in the budget. The actual for last year actually came about 1.5 million less than that. It came in about 289.24.
So, but you said part of it comes from last year, part of it will come from next year. So part of this $3 million would come from next year.
Half of the current, that 3 million is just under 1%.
Right. But about half of that would be part of a tax increase.
Right.
And then the rest of the revenues that are increasing ultimately come from the states, is a big chunk of it, right? The state's giving us more revenue.
General state aid is the largest area for this upcoming year.
Which the state's revenue source is taxpayers, whether they're paying a fee or they're paying a tax. So that money is still coming from a taxpayer. What assurances do we have that that's not going to go down, right? So it's gone down in the past. What do we do next year if that goes back down?
So if that goes back down, we have to make, cuts on the expenditure side to keep the budget balance. We won't know what next year's general state aid number will be. We don't get that number until the end of July, early August.
It's a big jump, 23 million
Right.
year to year, and it had gone down, a couple of years prior to that, right? It went from 69 to 62 million, 2012 to 2013. Before that, it was 67. It was hovering in this upper 60 threshold for a while. I haven't seen it, this number of 85 or 80, almost $86 million. That's a lot to count on next year. We'll be facing tough decisions. I know we've balance our budget year to year, but we need to have a long-term outlook as well, which is concerning when that portion of it is that much of a roller coaster when you're dealing with the state.
Well, as Dale mentioned, a lot of that is year to year, especially with general state aid. Some of the numbers you were referencing is because the state prorated the allocation. So again, for the past 3 years, we were coming forward to the board assuming it would stay just where it was. There wouldn't be any change in the allocation per student. Now, in theory, it's still put out there that they haven't cut funding based on at the student level, but what they did, they left the funding at $61.19, I believe it is per student, then prorated. So in reality, they did make a cut, but where we benefited this fiscal year, or will the rest of this fiscal year, is the census numbers from the poverty piece increased significantly because they use a 3-year average. And then the other piece is because of the steep drop in our EAV. EAV is a big part of the other part of the formula. So with that dropping, then the state picks up more portion of the student piece versus what in balance with the property tax. So, with the steep drops, if you reference back to the graph in the book, with the steep drops in EAV, that's going to keep pushing that general state aid number up. And census numbers coming into the poverty piece also stimulate the bottom part of that funding formula and add to the poverty money that the district receives.
The other thing that, I guess is a little bit concerning is the spending of the reserve, right? So it's approximately $8 million that we're spending from our reserve, what we're budgeting or planning to spend from the reserve. And when we do set taxes and levies, we can replenish it at that time with a tax increase, or we can deplete and diminish our reserve funds.
That wouldn't be the intention because the money that we're allocating over into the operating fund is restricted. It was from the bond sale this last bond sale that the district put out in 2012 that was restricted for capital use only. And we would never be our intention to go back and refund it with property tax money. The bonds were sold for a specific purpose. We'll spend it for that purpose, and when the money's gone, the money's gone.
And if we need to build more buildings or do other capital things, and we look at another bond at that time.
Someplace else. Yes, either it's another bond or some other source.
Jeff, I know that you presented sort of the timeline and the process for the budget, but could you briefly summarize that again? This is the end of this whole process.
Yeah, this is essentially the end of the process for the year. I mean, the process starts in January, February, where we meet. We start meeting with all the parties within the district, all the departments, anybody who receives an allocation out of the budget for the purpose to run a program or manage certain operations. We'll meet with them, figure out what their needs are. Then we'll move forward, Dale and his group and myself, and put together a tentative budget. In April, we bring that forward to the board, get some feedback from the board, continue to see how revenues and expenditures are progressing in that particular fiscal year, make additional adjustments. And then we start this process where we come before the board 2 or 3 times presenting the budget book and where we think things are going to be with the fiscal year that we've already started. But yes, this is the end of the process. And for us, internally, it starts up again.
Just for the public's benefit and my own, what were some of the, maybe just an estimation of how much was increased or decreased in the budget since the process started? Did it stay about the same? Did it go up? Did it go down? Were cuts made? Not exact specific things that were cut, but just an estimate.
A lot of both occurred. I mean, some of the larger lines, communications, there were some other, I can't think of them all off the top of my head, that we made cuts within and reallocated them into areas for preschool, dual language, all-day kindergarten, applying them to areas that focus more on what the district's mission and goals are, and taking